Okay, hopefully folks can see that. We good? Yeah, okay. So as I mentioned, I'm Dana Goodson. I'm with the National Center for Environmental Conflict Resolution at the Udall Foundation. And for those who aren't familiar with the Udall Foundation, we're actually a small federal agency. We were established by Congress to honor the legacy of Morris and Stewart Udall, who you can see pictured here. Morris was a longtime congressman from Arizona, and his brother Stewart was Secretary of the Interior. And they were really known for their work in a couple of areas. One, in protecting and promoting the nation's environment, public lands, and natural resources, and also promoting the rights and self-governance of Native nations. And you can see both of those areas kind of reflected in the programs of the foundation. As I mentioned, I'm with the National Center, and our presentation team is with the Native Nations Institute, one of our sister programs. So we're really pleased to be able to be working with them on this effort. Just briefly about the National Center, our mission is to help federal agencies, tribes, states, and others collaborate, work together, and resolve any kind of potential conflicts around environmental, natural, and cultural resource issues. And that can include helping agencies develop internal capacity to address challenges like that. And we do have a training program. I think some of you may have participated in that. And so kind of how we come into this, we're coming to this particular webinar, which is in the context of an effort we're working on in partnership. We have an interagency agreement with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and that is to administer and facilitate the West Coast Tribal Cultural Landscapes Assessment in areas of potential offshore wind development on the West Coast. And so you can see on this slide here, there's kind of a definition, a working definition of tribal cultural landscapes, which was developed by Pence in a previous tribal cultural landscape pilot effort in partnership with BOEM. And it's, as you can see, it's really up to Indigenous peoples to define their relationship to a particular area and its resources. And so this tribal cultural landscape is meant to be proactive and tribally driven. And through the tribal cultural landscapes effort, tribes will be collecting and controlling their own data and only sharing non-sensitive, non-confidential information with agencies, with the public, and so on. So the goal is really to give Native nations the opportunity to gather the information they need on their cultural resources that could be affected by offshore wind development, have that information ready for any potential decision-making, any potential consultations that might become. So given that the data through this effort is that's going to be collected, it needs to be kept confidential, needs to be protected, we thought it would be valuable to think about the mechanisms and processes for doing that. And that's where we feel really, at least I feel very lucky, very privileged to be able to work with our partners at the Native Nations Institute, who have just a long experience in history and expertise in working in issues of Indigenous data sovereignty. So really pleased to be able to bring them bring their expertise to bear on this project and help us think through those questions. So some tribes, and going back to the tribal cultural landscapes assessment, some tribes already have some contracts in process, or have contracts with us and are actually working on their assessments. Some have contracts in process, and others are kind of still thinking about whether they want to participate. So if you're interested and you're not in contact with me and Courtney, please feel free to reach out to us. Courtney's going to put some more information in the chat on the tribal cultural landscapes effort and our emails, so you can feel free to reach out to us. So this particular webinar builds on a previous webinar that we held with the Native Nations Institute about a year ago. That really was an introductory webinar to the principles, like the CARE principles of Indigenous data governance, as well as traditional knowledge and biocultural labels and notice system. So that kind of set the stage for what we're going to be doing today, which is after that first webinar, we talked to the Native Nations team and thought, okay, what would be a really helpful next step is to really help Native nations and their partners at data repositories think through how can they implement these principles? How can they start to work through this? So that was the inspiration for the webinar today. So one thing I'll just mention, there will be kind of opportunities for Q&A throughout the presentation, and we will kind of prioritize those that are related to tribal cultural landscapes, but we'll also welcome those from people who are not necessarily participating in that effort. So with that, and you can see here, here's the bios of our team. As I mentioned, I feel really lucky to be working with them. They're very busy people. They're doing a lot of good work. So it's really great that they've made the time to really think through all these questions with us. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Andrew Martinez. He's going to be facilitating the webinar today. So please join me in welcoming the Native Nations team.
Hi, thank you, Dana, for that introduction. Hauka to my Southern California natives, and Skiptash if we have any folks from Arizona. Andrew Martinez. I've been with the Native Nations Institute since 2015, and I've been working with Dr. Stephanie Carroll Russo Carroll since on the IDSolve work since then, and it's been a ride. And we've been told that this will never work, and here we are working it. So I'm always excited to kind of slam dunk on those folks who tell us this is never going to go anywhere, because we're moving. And so I'm excited to have everyone on the call today. I'm going to get my screen shared. There we go. So quick introduction for myself there. I'm going to invite Jane and Riley to unmute and join and introduce themselves, and then we'll get started with the presentation today. So I'll call out Riley first, and then go ahead and take it away, Jane.
Thank you, Andrew. Wanas Hafade Todes Hamzu, Guahusi Riley Taitingfang. My name is Riley Taitingfang. I'm Chamorro, so from the island of Guahan or Guam in the Pacific. And today I'm joining you from the unceded territories of the Kumeyaay Nation in San Diego, California. I'm a postdoc with the Native Nations Institute working on the implementation of CARE principles in data repositories and other institutions. Very nice to be here. Thank you for having us. And I'll pass it to Professor Anderson.
I am today here firmly in the Seminole Nation, but I normally work in Lenape-Hoking, what's currently known as New York City. I have a legal background in intellectual property law and have been working on a range of strategies to support returns in a variety of ways back to Indigenous nations. And so I'm really delighted to be here with you today and to share all this work with you.
All right, so as we get started, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that the University of Arizona is on the lands and territories of Indigenous peoples, specifically the O'odham and Yaqui peoples. Arizona itself is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, and we are continuously striving to work and build sustainable relationships with the sovereign nations and Indigenous communities throughout education offerings, partnerships, community service, and that's part of what we're doing here today. So as we get started, a little bit on the presentation and what we'll be covering. We'll be doing a grounding Indigenous data sovereignty section. This is mostly because we never know who's in the room. And so some folks may be familiar with the work, some may not. And we just want to make sure that everyone has that same foundation there. We're then going to transition into steps of reclaiming tribal data, cover a little bit of the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance. And then Jane's going to take it over and handle the traditional knowledge and biocultural label notices from the local context, and then share a little bit on the examples in practice. And as we transition from each portion of the presentation, we'll be stopping and pausing for questions. So Jane and Riley are going to monitor chat while I share screen today, and they will bring up the questions as they come up. So feel free to drop them in there. We will have opportunities for folks to unmute as well and join us that way if you'd like. And please make sure your mic is muted up until those points. So getting started, grounding Indigenous data sovereignty. So as we move forward, quick tour, 4 key points and positioning statements. Sovereignty matters and is central to research relationships. It's central to a lot of Native nation relationships. Data are relations, and we forge that and forget. We need to make sure that we uphold our responsibilities to that data as well. And we're not only talking about contemporary responsibilities, but traditional. So we have, as Indigenous peoples, intergenerational relationships with data, and they are critical to the exercise of tribal sovereignty. Only Indigenous peoples and nations can exercise Indigenous data sovereignty, and we are rights holders as recognized by federal governments and state governments and such. Indigenous organizations and other governments, corporations, and institutions may generate and hold Indigenous data. However, we are the rights holders. So as part of her dissertation work, my teammate, awesome teammate, Dr. Dominique David Chavez, developed a scale of levels of Indigenous community engagement and research to assess how researchers access Indigenous knowledge systems and how they engage with communities and community members who maintain those systems. As part of this was adapted from a participatory agricultural research framework, and it's based on who holds authority to govern in research processes, as well as ranging from no engagement on the left-hand side, representing extractive practices of community engagement, to self-determined Indigenous-led processes on the right-hand side. And so applied to a global systematic review analyzing 20 years of climate studies that included Indigenous knowledges in their research, Dr. David Chavez found that 87% of studies were extractive, representing colonial legacies, which is typically known as business as usual. And as we move forward, yet there's a handful of studies as well as numerous grassroots community efforts that live on self-determined end of the scale. And this is what we're working towards shifting to. So we ask the question is, how can researchers, repositories, funders, and other institutions support the shift to self-determined community engaged science? One way is through changing data relationships. And so we ask the question, how do we move institutions from extractive, transactional, colonial practices and reconfigure power relationships to put Indigenous data into Indigenous hands? Moving forward, Indigenous peoples data include data generated by us as Indigenous peoples, tribal peoples, as well as governments, non-native governments, private sector, and other institutions on and about Indigenous peoples, their communities, non-human kin as well. So Indigenous peoples data comprise information, knowledge about non-human kin, the environment, land, skies, and resources. And one of the ways that I remind folks about this and sort of reframe this, because it may not seem too familiar with folks, but this to me relates back to our clan relationships, traditional clanships, because some of those clan relations relate to what we now view as resources within our environments. And so we need to remember our connections there. Individuals, as we move forward as well, information about Indigenous individuals, such as administrative, census data, health, social, commercial, and corporate. And then data about us as collectives, information and knowledge about us as traditional cultural information, oral histories, ancestral clan knowledge, pointing back to the first point as well, cultural sites, stories, and belongings. And so here's our definition of Indigenous data. So Indigenous data sovereignty is the right of Indigenous peoples to govern the data from collection to storage, to use and reuse. Finance Foundation's inherent sovereignty. Only Indigenous peoples and nations as rights holders can exercise Indigenous data sovereignty. It is the responsibility and expression of the processes, traditions, and roles that communities have for the care and use of this knowledge. Using a human rights framework, Indigenous data sovereignty leverages tools such as laws, policies, and agreements, including the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, nation-state recognition of Indigenous peoples, treaties, and other mechanisms. We do point to UNDRIP within this work, even though within the US framework, we do have Supreme Court cases, federal recognition, state recognition treaties, because we do push this work globally. And in some cases, in some states, in some nations, Indigenous people do not have that sort of legal recognition. And so we want to make sure that we're bringing in that inclusivity as well. Indigenous data sovereignty underscores that knowledge belongs to the collective and is fundamental who we are as people. And so not just worried about the individual, but as a collective as a whole. Reclaiming Indigenous data sovereignty through indigenizing data governance and decolonizing data. Currently, we're often in a state of data dependency where indigenous data and tribal data systems have long been suppressed and usurped to meet the needs of others. And this being the federal government, reporting requirements, specific questions asked by researchers that fit funder requirements. Indigenous data sovereignty is aspirational. Native nations strive to achieve IDSOV or indigenous data sovereignty through decolonizing data and indigenizing data governance. Decolonizing data occurs as Native nations replace external, non-norm, non-tribal priorities with tribal systems that define data. We have our general definition that we use. Tribes can come up with their own definition as well. Control how it's collected, control how data is collected, and influence how data is used. It results in findings delivered from both external data collected on indigenous peoples, but also internal data collected and produced by tribes that reflect the understandings of those peoples. Indigenizing data governance is a means of implementing greater indigenous data sovereignty and is the act of harnessing tribal values, principles, and mechanisms. These can be tribal values that are contemporary, but also traditional as well. Indigenous ways of knowing and doing and applying them to the management and control of Native nations' data ecosystems. So as we center sovereignty here, part of this is recognizing that data are critical to the exercise of tribal sovereignty. Going back to one of the first key points that I mentioned on our second slide, indigenous peoples require data for governance and self-determination, self-determined decision-making. When activating indigenous data sovereignty, Native nations and other data agents, states, federal agencies, replace external non-tribal norms and priorities with tribal data systems that define data, control how it's collected, influence, and how it's used. It results in findings both. Oh, I'm sorry, reading the wrong slide here. Making sure that we're shifting from the process of, as we go through Native nation building, we exercise greater governance over data. Tribes then rebuild data systems, as you note on the right-hand side of the circle here. And as a cyclical pattern goes around, that data is then used to exercise greater governance over and help define those tribal goals, is part of what we're trying to say here. So as tribes go through the process of Native nation building, they exercise greater governance over data that is theirs, related to them, rebuild their data systems, and then shift back out and apply that data to their governance systems. Steps to reclaiming indigenous data. Currently, indigenous peoples are often in a state of data dependency. This would be recognized here at the bottom. There are indigenous data and tribal data systems have long been suppressed to meet the needs of others. Here at the very top, we're going to look at the top three: by us, for them, by us, for us, and by them, with us. When we talk about us within this context, us is indigenous peoples, them would be non-native data actors. So in case this could be the states, this could be federal agency as well. So data collected or built by us, reported out to them. Data by us, for us. This is a tribe or an indigenous community collecting data, or I should say defining what data they need and collecting it for themselves. And then by them, with us. This is the assistance, this is the partnerships, these are the collaborations of researchers and federal agencies collecting data by them with our input as well. And so this is what we want to talk back. And what we want to do is reach towards that top where we're driving tribal agendas that creates evidence-based policies, defining how data are fed back into larger entities. Or sorry, larger data ecosystem. And so this is one of my favorite slides, noting that our peoples have always been data experts. And so indigenous peoples, data experts, data has not always been binary, digitized ones and zeros. It's not always been extracted and placed into spreadsheets. Data has been stored throughout traditional forms of storage and expressed through traditional forms of storage. On the right-hand side here, we have a totem pole. In the middle or the center top, we have a Lakota winter count. We have our wampum blanket here at the base. And on the right-hand side, we have an example of an autumn calendar stick. Now, this is an example from my communities in Arizona, of which images are then etched onto or burned into a saguaro cactus stick. And if anyone's been out to Arizona and seen the saguaro cacti, they can get pretty tall, 14 to 20 feet tall in some cases. I believe this one's maybe 3 to 4 feet. And these are images that were depicted and helped store events and other sort of happenings that happen throughout the year, and stored and collected by community members as well. And so data is not a foreign concept to Indigenous peoples. Maybe the digitized versions could be, but as of right now, this form of data storage is traditional. And this is always a point where I'd like to invite the other tribal community members on the call to think about the ways in which this is reflected within their communities.
Okay, thank you. So next we'll be walking through specific steps that can be taken by both Indigenous peoples and third-party data holders to facilitate the reclamation of tribal data. Next slide, please. One more slide, please. Okay, so first we're going to walk through how Indigenous peoples reconnect to and reclaim their data. And the questions and recommendations on the next 2 slides are meant to help Indigenous peoples towards finding their data and then entering into relationships with third-party holders about use. So as an initial step, we begin with locating your data. And one place to start is by identifying your data needs. So what kind of data is your tribal nation or community interested in accessing and using? And from there, you might initiate a process to identify where those data may sit. And this can involve identifying anyone who may have worked with your community before or may have engaged in data collection. So universities, researchers, or various agencies or federally funded projects. And you may also consider whether there's some department that holds permits for research and data collection with whom you could work to locate data of interest. And additionally, it'd be important to ask whether there's any record of provenance for the data held within the community. Then moving to access. Once you locate your data, you'll pursue questions and actions for how to access it. How the data are currently held and governed is an important consideration. And this could entail identifying any data access and use agreements in place, and also considering what format the data are in and whether they are easily shareable. Next slide, please. So next is thinking about use, reuse, and future permissions. So you'll want to ask what permissions are required to use the data and what the scope and limitations of use around those data are. And this could prompt considerations of things like transfer, future acquisitions, and new data, collection of new data. Then for policy creation, it's also important to consider what policies you may be able to enact to access and determine the use of your data. So for instance, things like tribal codes, government to government relationships, and or specific policy directives. Okay, next slide, please. And next, we want to share some advice to Indigenous peoples for sharing data with third parties. So first, under decisions about sharing, Indigenous tribes, nations, and communities need to consider what to share and when to share or not to share. And in instances when some funding sources might mandate sharing, you can invoke the concept that data ought to be as open as possible and as closed as necessary. And so this is a conversation established within the FAIR principles and reinforced through the interconnected and complementary care principles, which Professor Carroll will describe in more detail in a bit. Next is identifying, previous slide, thank you. Next is identifying mechanisms for sharing. And so these are mechanisms that can be leveraged to honor those decisions about what and when to share or not to share. So thinking about establishing and invoking data sharing agreements, making sure there's clear metadata that includes provenance information so data can be properly tied to the rights and interests of Indigenous communities, tribes, or nations, and also mobilizing tools like managed or federated sharing. Okay, next slide. Next, we'll think about how third-party data holders can work with Indigenous peoples in relation to their data and to facilitate data reclamation. And so again, we'll consider this process from location of data to considerations surrounding its access, use, and reuse. So first, for locating Indigenous data within your holdings, you'll want to start with the question of whether you are aware of Indigenous data within your repository or institution, and consider where those data sit and what your role might be with respect to those data. And we also recommend engaging in processes of internal education, so making others within your setting aware of different data statuses. And so one example might be applying different geospatial tools to make visible which samples and associated data have been collected from tribal lands. And so we've seen groups do this where they're adding digital layers to maps to display, for instance, federally recognized tribal borders to then identify samples collected from within those boundaries. So this could be a useful kind of initial step in identifying Indigenous data within your holdings and then raising awareness about those holding that data within your setting. And so then this should also be tied to facilitation of access of those data. And so, you know, again, third-party data holders have a responsibility to disclose Indigenous collections and data and to make visible and transparent the presence of those data within their holdings. So it would be important to consider various models of access, like differentiated access to align access to Indigenous rights and interests. And it will also be important to think about whether you have clear provenance tied to those data. Okay, now I'm going to pass it to Professor Jane Anderson to continue on advice to third-party data holders.
Thanks, Riley. So when we're thinking about advice to third-party holders of Indigenous peoples' data, we're thinking a lot about the different kinds of ways in which Indigenous data is often hidden from Indigenous communities. So what are the kind of ways in which not only do we need to make Indigenous data visible and transparent so that Indigenous communities can make decisions about its use, but what other kinds of policies and principles can be put in place by those third-party data holders generally that mean that Indigenous data, as it comes into those third-party data repositories, maintains its connection back to Indigenous communities so that in the future that data can be used for and by Indigenous communities. So we're thinking about making data holdings transparent to specific communities, and we'll go into a little bit about the mechanisms that can support that through the labels and the notices that we're going to talk about in a minute, but also thinking about creating different kinds of workflows that are directed by tribal interests. This includes enriching or kind of adding metadata to data so that some of the provenance information that Riley was just speaking about is actually clearly or has clear fields for inclusion. We might also be thinking about the transfer or kind of ownership and control of that data. And where possible, Indigenous data should be transferred back to Indigenous communities. And this can be done by agreements and in different kinds of documentation. And then, of course, we're thinking about the future ongoing data creation and making sure that there are clear policies in place that support not only the care principles for Indigenous data governance, but also tribally determined mechanisms are included so that that kind of future use is tribally determined. We're also including and have written a template document that is called the Care Principles for Indigenous Peoples Data Sharing Agreement between an organization and an organization. So either a providing tribal nation, but also might be requested by a different kind of organization. So we've created this template document. We have shared it in the chat, but we'll also share the link to that as we share this, this recording. I'll just hand it over to Stephanie Carroll to talk about the care principles.
Hi, everybody. So I'm going to speak about the care principles, and then we'll talk about some ways that they can be implemented in the situations that we've spoken about here today. Next slide, Jean. So over the past about 7 years since the term Indigenous data sovereignty was coined to represent an ongoing movement over the life of contact around data, the Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous data governance policy work and publications, both within the sphere of scholarship, but also within practice levels, have been really exploding, especially over the past 2 years. And so we've seen publications, including the founding Indigenous data sovereignty book, as well as principles at various levels, including international, which are the care principles that I'll speak to, as well as for regions such as First Nations in Canada and Maori and Aotearoa, New Zealand. So I'm going to speak to the high-level care principles for Indigenous data governance here today. Next slide, Jane, please. So really, in response to the increased generation and use of data in open data, big data, open science, and research environments, and increasing limited opportunities for Indigenous control and access to that data, a network of Indigenous scholars led the development of the care principles for Indigenous data governance. So in 2019, the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, or GIDA, released the care principles. And these principles set forth critical considerations for non-tribal data creators, stewards, and users, and are designed to guide the inclusion of Indigenous peoples in data governance and at the same time increase their access to data. The care principles really shift the focus of data governance from consultation to values-based relationships, and have been widely recognized as enriching the discussion of collective rights to data more broadly within data discussions. Next slide, please. So the care principles include 4 principles and 3 sub-principles for each one. They are collective benefit, which details that data ecosystems shall be designed and function in ways that enable Indigenous peoples as collectives to benefit from data. Click, Jane. Authority to control emphasizes the need for those working with data to uphold Indigenous peoples' rights to and support their interest in data. Responsibility reminds us that those working with Indigenous data must center Indigenous people's self-determination and collective benefit in data relationships. And ethics focuses on using Indigenous people's ethics to guide decisions on harms, benefits, justice, and future use. So these high-level care principles direct those interacting with Indigenous data toward regional, for example, the First Nations principles of OCAP, or tribal-specific data guidance. Next slide, please. The care principles bring a people and purpose orientation to data governance, which complements purposefully the data-centric nature of the popular FAIR principles, which are findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. The FAIR principles seek to increase data sharing, and implementation of care and FAIR principles together should be seen as necessary to allow Indigenous peoples to govern, access, and use their data and share on their own terms. Next slide. Currently, the vast majority of Indigenous data, ranging from ethnographic material to biological materials to Earth observations and so on, are neither FAIR nor CARE, so they fall in that bottom quadrant there. Indigenous collections and data can be hard to find. They can be buried in larger collections and data sets and repositories or researcher possessions. They're often mislabeled, and they do not indicate the Indigenous peoples who are related to those data, and thus are not searchable. Indigenous peoples largely are not the legal rights holders. Indigenous collections and data, therefore, are not FAIR and do not perpetuate Indigenous provenance, protocols for use and sharing, or permissions. CARE was created to be complementary of FAIR and have to assist in having a continuing relationship with data throughout the data lifecycle. So we need to imagine how we implement FAIR and CARE together to assure Indigenous relationships to data throughout our use, our stewardship, and the future use of those data. Next slide. So we are concerned about implementing FAIR and CARE on already existing data, as well as instituting policies and practices to operationalize FAIR and CARE in the ongoing creation of new data that incorporates Indigenous knowledges and relationships to those data. So some of the tools to make this a reality include using Indigenous people's own laws, policies, and practices, and investing in Indigenous data systems. Updating other governments and institutions' policies and practices is another necessary step towards ethical inclusion of Indigenous people's data in external data systems. Next slide, please. The goal then really is to create law, policy, ethics, and infrastructure that support Indigenous rights to Indigenous data throughout the data lifecycle and across the data ecosystem, and to strengthen those rights by making changes, even minimal at first, across data actors such as research institutions, repositories, publishers, funders, and more. Next slide, please. So I want to underscore that there are not just simple one tool to use for each principle, that these tools and mechanisms that we're talking about, such as tribal codes, tribal research review process, data access protocols, cover and address a number of the different principles for care. Next slide, please. So next, we're going to shift to some discussion of the local context, labels, and notices, which allow us to implement care through some tools to create relationships where they may not exist, or maintain relationships where they already do exist with data, and strengthen the care and fair within those data. Jane?
Great. Thanks, Steph. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the traditional knowledge and biocultural labels and notices. And these are just one tool that have been developed that really align and support the care principles, but also provide a practical mechanism for Indigenous communities to assert their authority and autonomy in relationship to data that's not only been historically collected, but also into the future as more and more data comes and is generated by Indigenous communities for Indigenous governance. So the traditional knowledge labels are machine and human readable digital tags. They were developed as part of work done with partnering with communities over the last 12 years to really address kind of inconsistencies and the failure of legal mechanisms to actually support Indigenous interests, not only in data, but also in heritage collections at large. The traditional knowledge labels are really grouped in three different kinds of categories. They are provenance labels, there are protocol labels, and there are permission labels. And what they do is bring Indigenous cultural authority back into records that have largely excluded Indigenous interests. So whilst we might be starting with attribution and acknowledgement at kind of one basic level, what the labels are aiming for and pushing towards is different kinds of accountability and autonomy that mean that Indigenous control over Indigenous data is actually realized within the data systems themselves. So we have traditional knowledge labels, and we also have biocultural labels. The biocultural labels are a more recent addition to the suite of labels, but they really speak to interests that might be more aligned in this webinar in relationship to data that's coming out of Indigenous lands and waters in terms of biospecimens, soils, water, different kinds of environmental DNA, different kinds of data that's related to kind of cultural landscape assessments that might be needed to be done. Particularly with the biocultural labels, there's also a clear insistence on the capacity for Indigenous peoples to define when and how collaborations and research might be done using the data that's being collected. So just an example of how the labels are utilized, and just to give you a taste of a couple of the labels, we talked a little bit earlier in relationship to the non-verified label, and how do you deal with data that might not have been generated in the way that a community decides, and also might have mistakes in it. That's what we use the non-verified label for. But most communities begin by utilizing the attribution label. That's the label that most clearly brings Indigenous names and Indigenous authority back into a record where it previously was missing. But there's also a label called the culturally sensitive label that really speaks to cultural sensitivities that might sit around particular kinds of data that's not necessarily religious in origin or sacred. We have a sacred label, but actually speaking to different kinds of sensitivities about access that come from lack of access or different kinds of histories of settler colonialism. We also have the seasonal label. The seasonal label is a label that allows communities to connect knowledge and data to land and the different kinds of relationships and significance that derives from land-based teachings. So that kind of seasonal label brings or bridges these spaces between knowledge and place and land. This is an example from the Scowlitz Band of the Stolo First Nation in what's currently known as British Columbia, which speaks to how the labels get customized by the communities. So whilst we have 19 labels, every community has the sovereign right to define the content of each label. So this is an example of the Scowlitz customizing the attribution label. Here you can see that they've customized it into their own language, Holkamalem, literally meaning name and place, but also their own description of the label, what it means to Scowlitz, why they're utilizing it, and what they're asking other people to do when they encounter this label. Next, I'm going to show you a couple of examples of the labels being utilized by communities to kind of bring back name and authority into some kind of larger contexts. This is the Library of Congress. This is an online record of wax cylinders for the Passamaquoddy Nation in northern Maine. These were the first wax cylinders made on native homelands in the United States in 1890. And this is all that was all the data that was collected with these recordings and displayed in the Library of Congress. You can see from this record, it's very impoverished. And this is what most records around Indigenous collections look like. There's just been no consultation, no partnership, and no kind of updating of that record with Indigenous community input. This is what the new record looks like after that work of partnering with the Passamaquoddy Nation. Passamaquoddy have added their own titles to these songs now, but they've added pages of traditional knowledge. And they've also added the traditional knowledge labels, and they felt comfortable sharing that information with the Library of Congress because they were also incorporating the traditional knowledge labels, which really meant that their name and authority was brought back into the record in a really visible way. So the Passamaquoddy decided to use the attribution label. They have translated that into their own language, Eliatsik. They've used the outreach label, really meaning that this is the decision by the community that this material can be utilized for educational purposes, and also the non-commercial label that this material shouldn't be used in a commercial context. So this is the public-facing, human readable part of what I was mentioning around the labels. But this has also raised the question about how do you build this new Indigenous authority into already existing subfields. And this was kind of a challenge encountered by the Library of Congress, partly because data fields haven't been built to include Indigenous interests. And so kind of what is required to make that intervention into the metadata of a data field. So this is kind of where the Library of Congress landed with the MARC record, which is to include the labels and subfield, which would normally include the rights field, the information about who holds the rights to the recording. This is another example of communities adding their labels into biocultural collections. This is a plant collection. The Whakatohia Nation in Etaroa have included their provenance label here, clearly demarcating their interests in the plant that comes from their homelands. So if we develop the labels as particular tools for Indigenous communities to assert authority and sovereignty over already existing collections and data that is created into the future, we also developed some tools that support the disclosure of Indigenous data that is already held within institutions, and really leaning into the responsibility that institutions and data repositories have to make those collections of Indigenous data transparent and visible to Indigenous communities so that Indigenous communities can start adding their authority back into these spaces. We have 4 notices that we developed, the Open to Collaborate notice, as well as 3 disclosure notices, the Attribution Incomplete notice, the Biocultural notice, and the Traditional Knowledge notice. We are also working towards developing a standard in this area in relationship to the IEEE, which is the recommended practice for the provenance of Indigenous peoples' data. There is an Indigenous working group that is chaired by Stephanie, and we have been working for the last 3 years to develop a draft recommended practice for the provenance Indigenous peoples' data. And if anybody on this call is interested in being joining that group or hearing more about or reading the recommended practice, we'll encourage you to contact us to be part of the consultation that we're doing at the moment in relationship to that draft. So just to end, I wanted to give a couple more examples in practice of the labels and the notices and how these can support not only Indigenous governance over Indigenous data, but also how it can start to change not only data repository practice, but also the practices of researchers working in partnership with Indigenous peoples around the collection of data on Indigenous homelands. This is an example of the Open to Collaborate notice being utilised by an institution. In this instance, it's the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. The American Philosophical Society holds the country's largest collection of Indigenous languages. The Center for Native American Indigenous Research was already partnering with Indigenous communities and working to repatriate language materials as much as it could back to Indigenous communities, but it had no way of making that work transparent to Indigenous communities. So they decided to utilize the Open to Collaborate notice as a meaningful way of indicating the work that that institution is already undertaking in terms of thinking through decolonial practice and return of Indigenous languages. This is an example of a metadata database called Geome, incorporating the biocultural notices as visible notification of accompanying cultural rights and responsibilities, so sitting around material samples that have been collected from Indigenous communities. So that option now exists within Geome for any researcher who has been partnering with Indigenous communities to make visible in the storage of the data the accompanying cultural rights that sit with that data moving forward. This is an example of the European Reference Genome Atlas. This has been a project for URGA to create different kinds of data fields and associated in their data manifest as they transfer data into next and third data, the next kind of data repository. So they kind of assess the data that has been incorporated within their reference genome atlas. They create a manifest and then move that data forward. And in doing that, they look and see whether Indigenous rights have been included, whether traditional knowledge or biocultural rights are applicable, whether there is associated traditional knowledge, whether there are ethics and permits. And then they record that as they transfer that data across to that next data repository. In this example, this is an example from Maine in relationship to an environmental DNA project. They're working to think through what it looks like from the very beginning of the sampling process on Wabanaki homelands in Maine. Maine is the homelands of 4 different tribal nations. All of them have interests in any samples that are taken from the water or the soils in Maine. And this project is really developing new workflows for how Indigenous interests can be recorded at the very sampling process itself. So when a researcher is out on Indigenous homelands, how they can incorporate those interests by utilizing either the biocultural or the traditional knowledge notice in the very kind of collection of the sample itself. And then what that looks like as the sample goes into the laboratory, the different kinds of data that comes out of the sample through the different sequencing, and then how those interests are maintained as that data is sent to another third-party data repository. So this is really done through the project and naming the project, and Local Contexts has a particular way of generating the labels and the notices, and we'll kind of include that in the chat and in the kind of accompanying information in relationship to this recording. And this is all kind of connected around the project, and the project provides a specific and permanent ID that enables the notices and the labels to connect to each other across the life cycle of the data, which was kind of what Stephanie was speaking to earlier in relationship to that data life cycle and making sure that Indigenous interests are recognized in every part of that life cycle. The main eDNA are also utilizing the Open to Collaborate notice, but also the biocultural notice, again, making visible and transparent the responsibility that the project has to maintain and to make visible Indigenous interests that sit within and will always be part of this project into the future. So just the final example is again back to one I mentioned before about the Whakatohea labels, which is in a federal collection within Aotearoa. This federal collection is in Manaaki Whenua, and they have 5 different kinds of nationally significant collections: a herbarium, microorganisms, flax collections, arthropods, and also fungi. Within this collections, there are over 670,000 records, and Manaaki Whenua has added a biocultural notice to every single record that is in their collections database. This means that Indigenous interests have been recognised in every single record that they have and that they hold. What that then allows for is communities to add their labels to those sample records. And this is an example of a community adding 2 labels to their collection here. This is the biocultural provenance label, but also the consent verified label has been added. This is another example of a community adding 4 labels to their collection: the provenance, the research use, therefore kind of saying they're open to be connected and contacted in relationship to future research, and open to collaborate around any kind of future research that might want to happen on this particular specimen. So just in conclusion, the local context community of users at the moment includes 34 countries with over 116 communities that are actively utilizing the labels on a variety of different kinds of projects. There are 236 institutions that are using notices to disclose Indigenous interests that are sitting within their collections. There's 165 researchers that are utilizing notices to disclose Indigenous interests at the beginning of their research projects. And there are 235 projects that have been generated by communities, researchers, and institutions to connect and to bring Indigenous governance back into both legacy collections, but also collections that are being created today. So I'll finish there, but Stephanie and Riley, do you want to just say goodbye and thank you as well? Thank you so much for joining us, and I'll hand it back to Stephanie and Riley.
Yes, thank you everybody for joining us today, Chanan. And I'm grateful for your input, and please reach out if you have comments or interest in this work. Riley?
Sainama Ase, thank you everybody.
Thank you everybody, and grateful for your time.